TMNT Meet Archie, Archie Comics, 1991. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, four 6-foot mutant turtles who'd spent the previous 7 years fighting the Foot Clan, the Krang, and Shredder across a blood-soaked New York City, landed one day after the burial of Bubba the Glublub in the most aggressively wholesome fictional zip code in America, Riverdale. The comic is officially titled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Meets Archie, though the indicia and credits page listed as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Adventures, a discrepancy that speaks to how much planning went into this particular collision of universes, which is to say, not very much. The cover bears the art of Dan DeCarlo, Ryan Brown, and Barry Grossman, with Barry Grossman handling colors and Scott Fulop editing, and the entire enterprise was delivered as a single issue rather than a series, which tells you exactly how seriously anyone took the long-term creative potential of Ninja Turtles meeting the Archies. The transportation mechanism was Cuddly the Cowlick, the giant floating bovine head in sunglasses who had already served as the T-Men Adventures series' preferred interdimensional taxi, and his appearance here wasn't framed as an anomaly, it was just a Tuesday for a cosmic cow. He deposited the four brothers into Riverdale without much preamble, and they immediately collided with Archie Andrews and Betty Cooper on a date at the chocolate shop, which is exactly the social situation a teenage ninja warrior would find most disorienting. The contrast between the turtles' lived experience, watching their sensei mutate, their city burn, their family nearly dissolve under Foot Clan pressure, and Archie's primary conflict of accidentally dating two girls at once, was so stark that the comic leaned into it rather than trying to reconcile the two worlds. The Turtles didn't get a Riverdale origin story. They just showed up, assessed the situation, and got to work. The comic is an anthology of 4 separate stories with different creative teams, only the first of which teams the Turtles with Archie's cast. A choice of antagonists so perfectly Archie comics that it might have been a parody if the comic weren't being sincere, and the Turtles immediately pivoted from being profoundly confused observers to the Riverdale gang's most capable rescue operators. The remaining 3 stories in the anthology each have separate writers and artists with no connection to the Archie crossover plot. The comic moved between these 2 plotlines with the scattergun pacing of something written under significant deadline pressure, because it almost certainly was. Dan DeCarlo was drawing the main Archie series at the same time, Ryan Brown was handling regular TMNT Adventures duties, and nobody was going to slow down the Archie Comics assembly line for a novelty issue. The result reads like 2 separate comics stapled together with a thin bridging scene, which is basically what it was. A comics historian might argue that this crossover had legitimate structural justification. Cuddly the Cowlick was already established as a reality-warping entity within TME Adventures continuity, capable of pulling the Turtles out of New York and into literally any scenario the writers needed. So a trip to Riverdale was just another day at the office for a character whose entire existence was a plot device. That's technically true, and it's the argument the comic itself would make if it had to defend itself. But Cuddly existed precisely because the TMNT Adventures series needed a way to shift genres without establishing any real continuity infrastructure. He was the narrative equivalent of a wormhole, useful for getting characters from point A to point B without explaining why points A and B should ever be in the same story. The specialist's objection is that the crossover had in-universe justification. The counter is that the in-universe justification was manufactured specifically to make the crossover possible, which means it explains nothing about why it needed to happen. The underlying mechanism was always cross-promotional reach at the height of the 1990 licensing frenzy, when TMNT was simultaneously in theaters, on Saturday morning television, on every toy shelf in America, and in monthly comic form from 2 different publishers. Archie Comics, by contrast, had been running on fumes creatively since the 1970s and was desperately looking for a vector back into the cultural conversation. Pairing their most stable property with the hottest property in entertainment was a strategy, not a storytelling impulse. The single-issue format confirmed this. No one at either publishing house believed there was enough narrative material for an ongoing series. They were right. What makes the comic genuinely interesting in retrospect is that it accidentally documented the exact moment when TMNT's cultural dominance was so absolute that the Archie Comics universe, which had operated in its own self-contained bubble for 30 years, was willing to let a talking cowhead teleport 4 mutant ninja directly into its main continuity for 22 pages. The comic didn't create that moment. It was the moment, frozen in ink. TMNT/Street Fighter, IDW Publishing, 2023. By 2023, TMNT crossovers weren't an event, they were a publishing schedule. While the Archie crossover was a rare accident of 1991 licensing opportunism, this 5-issue miniseries by Paul Allor and Ariel Medel landed in an era where the Turtles had already crossed paths with Batman, the Ghostbusters, the Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and virtually every licensable property IDW could get on a contract. TMNT hadn't just become the comics industry's most active crossover protagonist. At IDW, it was practically their structural identity. Street Fighter, meanwhile, was no stranger to licensed team-ups either, with Ryu and company having appeared in everything from SNK vs. Titles to various indie comics. A Turtles vs. Street Fighter crossover shouldn't register as surprising in this environment. It should feel inevitable, and yet the series went 5 issues with a collected edition arriving at $19.99, which means it moved enough copies to warrant a trade, which means readers engaged with it beyond completionist obligation. The series brings the IDW continuity Turtles, Leonardo, Raphael, Donatello, and Michelangelo into Atlantic City for a prestigious martial arts tournament where fighters from both universes have gathered, and fighters from both universes are disappearing. The Street Fighter roster brings Ryu, Ken, and Chun-Li into the conflict. The villain pairing is M. Bison, whose psycho power has been the ideological engine of Street Fighter's dark side since 1987, and Baxter Stockman, the bug-themed mad scientist whose relationship with the Turtles in IDW continuity has oscillated between reluctant alliance and outright betrayal across multiple story arcs. These aren't random antagonist selections, they're the most ideologically consistent villains in their respective universes, which means the crossover isn't just a fight comic, it's a story about two species of megalomania colliding. The plot unfolds as a mystery within a tournament, which is a perfectly serviceable structure for a martial arts crossover, and the Atlantic City setting gives both creative teams a playground they understand deeply. IDW's New York City sensibilities translated to the boardwalk, Capcom's absurdly detailed martial arts lore dropped into a recognizable American location. Jenica's inclusion is worth noting specifically because she represents a deliberate choice to use the full IDW roster rather than defaulting to the Classic Four, which means the series is writing from a position of expanded continuity rather than nostalgia. Her presence signals that this crossover isn't trying to be a greatest hits compilation of either property, it's trying to do something new with characters whose current stories people are actually following. Sarah Meyer's color work keeps the two universes visually distinct even when characters are sharing panels, which is harder than it sounds. Street Fighter's palette is saturated, tropical, almost aggressively vibrant, while the Turtles' New York lives in darker, grittier tones. Making them coexist without either feeling washed out requires real craft. The boring explanation for why IDW publishes TMNT crossovers with this kind of frequency is that it's good business. Two recognizable properties sharing a cover means built-in audience overlap, reduced marketing spend, and a higher floor on guaranteed sales. That's not wrong, but it also doesn't explain why the Turtles specifically have become comics' most crossover-prone franchise, outrunning Batman, Spider-Man, and the X-Men in terms of licensed team-up frequency during IDW's run. Batman did occasional crossovers, including the TMNT one, but he didn't do them with institutional regularity. Something in IDW's version of the Turtles makes them uniquely portable, and the Street Fighter crossover is a clean demonstration of what that something is. The Turtles under IDW were rebuilt from their 2011 relaunch forward with modular compatibility as a design requirement. Still the same four brothers, still recognizable, still operating within a continuity that matters to them, but flexible enough to slot into any external universe without destabilizing their own. That's why a TMT versus Street Fighter crossover reads as natural rather than forced. The characters were engineered for this exact scenario. The series doesn't just prove that TMT can share a story with Street Fighter, it proves that IDW's TMT can share a story with anything, and that flexibility was always the design. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which crossover event you think was the most satisfying team-up. Let's get back into it. TMT.Masters of the Universe, IDW.Dark Horse, 2024. Where the T-Tem/Street Fighter crossover affected one franchise's fighting game roster, Turtles of Grayskull pulls two entire fictional universes into a collision that threatens to destroy both. The IDW Turtles are chasing Shredder and Krang through the Technodrome's interdimensional portal when they emerge on Eternia, and immediately discover that Krang and Shredder aren't fleeing. They're meeting, and their host is a 7-foot-tall, skull-faced sorcerer with a magic sword and a centuries-long grudge against the universe's greatest hero. That hero, He-Man, is already missing when the Turtles land. which means the Dimension's primary defender has been out of commission during whatever deal these three villains have been cooking up. The deal involves weaponizing the one thing Eternia has never had and the one thing the Turtles know everything about: mutagen. Krang, the dimension-hopping brain in a walking robot suit, has found in Skeletor a supernatural partner who can unlock the alchemical pathways the Technodrome's science alone never could. Together they begin combining Ultron mutagen with demon magic, and the result is a purple poison that starts degrading reality itself across Eternia, turning the land's own magic against it the same way mutagen turned New York's sewer wildlife against the Turtles. This is the crossover's central conceit made tangible: two properties defined by their villains' repeated failures against their respective heroes, teaming up to weaponize each world's most dangerous biological process. Krang provides the alien mutagenic chemistry. Skeletor provides the demonic transmutation. The Turtles, who have lived with mutagen as a daily reality since birth, are the only ones on either side of the portal who actually understand what's being built. By issue 2, the alliance has shifted. The Turtles have connected with Eternia's defenders, and the combined force of New York Ninja and Eternian heroes faces a coalition that makes sense in a way most crossover villains never do. Skeletor has spent 40-plus years as a skull-faced maniac who keeps losing to a guy with a magic sword. He needed someone with Krang's alien technology to overcome the magical limitations he's been trapped inside. Krang spent decades trying to conquer dimensions with a robot body and a brain the size of a grapefruit. He needed Skeletor's raw sorceress power to reach places the Technodrome's portal technology couldn't open. Their alliance recontextualizes both of their stories rather than just slapping them together. When their mutagen magic fusion produces the purple poison, it's not a generic doomsday weapon. It's something that only works because both worlds' unique properties exist simultaneously. A toxin that mutates biological matter through supernatural means is a threat no single universe has the tools to counter alone. The series launched as a 4-issue limited series on September 25, 2024, co-published by Dark Horse and IDW, an arrangement necessitated by the fact that the intellectual property sat across Mattel's Masters of the Universe, Nickelodeon's TMNT, and required a publishing house that could handle both at once. Tim Seeley wrote with Freddie E. Williams II on art and Andrew Dalhouse on colors, and the project had a complicated gestation. A prior crossover titled He-Man/Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had been approved back in 2019, featuring the IDW Turtles before it was cancelled. The series marks a new chapter in TMNT and Masters of the Universe crossovers. The series brings together two very different fictional worlds under a single creative team. The fact that this crossover required two publishers, one cancelled predecessor, a toy line prequel, and a creative team spanning two very different fictional worlds to finally get made says something about how hard it is to execute these properly, and how rare it is when they actually pull it off. The Skeletor-Krang alliance sounds like it shouldn't work on paper. A interdimensional brain and a skull-faced sorcerer have nothing in common beyond wanting power they can't get on their own. But Skeletor needed Krang's alien technology to overcome the magical limitations he's been trapped inside for decades, and Krang needed Skeletor's raw sorceress power to breach dimensions the Technodrome's portal technology couldn't reach. When their mutagen magic fusion produces a purple poison that degrades reality itself, it's not a generic doomsday device. It's a weapon that only works because both worlds' properties exist in the same place, simultaneously. The Turtles' expertise with mutagen becomes the linchpin. They're the only ones on either side who understand what's happening at a biological level, and the Eternian heroes are the only ones with the cosmic scale power to contain it. The alliance that forms by issue 2 isn't forced. It's the only combination of forces capable of responding to a threat that no single universe could have produced alone. Wanted, Bebop and Rocksteady, Nickelodeon, 2016. The 1987 TMNT series is listed as a related show to the 2012 TMNT series, indicating a canonical connection between the two continuities. Kevin Eastman, co-creator of TMNT, wrote one of the 3 crossover episodes. The crossover coincided with the 30th anniversary of the original 1987 TMNT animated series. The DVD release included 4 episodes from Tales of the TMNT, episodes 15, 16, 17, and 10. The DVD also included the Ice Cream Kitty music video as a bonus special feature. The DVD had an MSRP of $21.99 and was available for pre-order on Amazon for just over $15. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers / Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 2019. The previous item found a canonical thread tying 2 TMNT continuities together through a related show listing, a tenuous but real bridge. But where that connection merely hinted at a shared universe, this crossover doesn't just cross a line, it obliterates the rule that the line ever existed in the first place. Power Rangers and TMNT occupy entirely separate media ecosystems, one born from superhero tokusatsu, the other from underground comics, and bringing them together required more than just a crossover event. It required rewriting how both properties understood themselves. Published across 5 issues by Boom Studios under license from Hasbro in partnership with IDW and Nickelodeon, the series landed at a moment when both franchises were actively reshaping their identities. IDW's TMNT had been running since 2011, building a continuity that leaned harder into the Mirage Studios' grit than any animated series had dared. Boom's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers had similarly stripped back its source material, trading the glossy 1990s tone for something closer in spirit to the original Super Sentai roots. Writer Ryan Parrott and artist Simone DiMeo didn't simply drop 2 teams into the same city and watch them fight. The plot hinges on a betrayal so specific and personal that it reframes one of Power Rangers' most sacred characters. Tommy Oliver, the Green Ranger, has joined forces with the Shredder and the Foot Clan. That choice is what separates this from 100 other Force team-up comics. Parrott described the project as feeling like a reimagined Lost episode for kids who grew up in the 1990s, but the execution outpaces that modest pitch. The series wastes no time establishing the fish face. The Rangers arrive in New York expecting to locate a stray putty patroller outbreak and instead find the Foot Clan operating with military precision, Tommy leading squads of elite ninja into engagements that shouldn't be possible without Ranger-level tactical awareness. The Shredder, meanwhile, has been studying Ranger technology, Zordon's energy signatures, the morpher frequency, the grid, and he's reverse engineering it. Issue 1, cover by Dan Mora, shows the Foot Clan in armor that visually echoes Ranger design language, and the message is unmistakable. This isn't an invasion from the outside. It's a corruption from within. The Turtles operate as the wild card neither side anticipated. Where the Rangers follow a strict chain of command and a code drilled into them by Zordon, the Turtles improvise, break protocol, and fight like people who grew up in sewers rather than a youth center. Leonardo's tactical mind clashes with the Rangers' structured team dynamics, while Raphael and Michelangelo keep throwing wrenches into every carefully planned engagement. Donatello, for his part, treats Ranger technology like a puzzle he was born to solve. The giant monster fights, and there are several, because Shredder has clearly been hoarding Foot Clan research alongside Ranger bioenergy, let both franchises deploy their full visual vocabulary, oversized kaiju smashing through Manhattan while ninja and spandex-clad heroes coordinate an attack from ground level and sky level simultaneously. Here's the thing. Defenders of the crossover genre will tell you that the magic happens when 2 properties respect each other's rules, and there's truth to that. But the real test is whether the story earns its premise rather than simply inheriting it, and this series earns the Green Ranger's turn to the dark side by treating it as the logical endpoint of a character who has spent decades cycling through identity crises. Tommy Oliver has been brainwashed, depowered, re-recruited, stripped of his powers, and mind-controlled more times than almost any character in the franchise's history. The Shredder exploiting that instability isn't a twist, it's a thesis. Parrott isn't just giving fans a novelty team-up. He's completing a story that Power Rangers' own continuity never quite resolved, using the Turtles as the catalyst, because no one else in the Ranger universe is equipped to handle a mind-game opponent operating on the Shredder's psychological level. That's what makes the landing actually satisfying. The series doesn't resolve Tommy's arc with a simple redemption punch. By the final issue, the question isn't whether he'll come back to the side of good, but whether the version of him that returns is the one the Rangers remember. The crossover respects both franchises' tonal commitments. The Turtles' code against killing remains intact even when fighting former allies, and the Rangers' optimism survives contact with one of the darkest corners of the TMNT universe. The story lands on the contradiction it opened with. Tommy Oliver, Green Ranger, the hero who defined a generation's understanding of what a Power Ranger could be, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the Shredder, by revealing that the contradiction was the point all along. The rule the previous item found in a TV listing was that crossovers need a canonical reason to exist. This one proves that sometimes the best reason is simply that 2 broken characters recognize the same fracture in each other. Turtles Forever, Warner Bros. Animation, 2009. Where the Power Rangers crossover expanded outward to a completely different media property, this one collapses inward. A crossover built entirely from within the TMEAGA, pulling together 3 distinct versions of the same 4 brothers, and the multiverse framework that finally made such a thing narratively coherent. Premiering on November 21, 2009, on the CW4 Kids as the culmination of the 2003 animated series' 7-season run, the 81-minute uncut film was produced by Mirage Studios and 4Kids Entertainment, directed by Roy Burdine and Lloyd Goldfine, and written by Goldfine alongside Rob David and Matthew Dardick. Premiering on November 21, 2009, it serves as the series finale for the 2003 animated series and a crossover event. The plot hinges on Chirel, the Utrom Shredder of the 2003 series, a villain whose back arc had consumed the show's best storytelling for years, discovering that his dimensional traveling technology works across the broader multiverse, not just within his own continuity. He begins systematically hunting alternate versions of the Turtles across infinite realities, erasing them one by one. The 2003 Turtles reach across dimensions for help when Chirel begins hunting alternate versions of themselves across realities, and they find the 1987 cartoon Turtles. The collision is immediate and intentionally jarring. The 1987 versions speak in puns, prioritize pizza over strategy, and treat ninja combat like a Saturday morning sport. The 2003 versions are tactical, traumatized, and have been fighting a war that never ends. Their interactions are where the film earns its runtime. Leonardo trying to coordinate a battle plan while Michelangelo 87 interjects with a snack-based joke produces a kind of comedic friction that neither series could achieve alone. But the film doesn't stop at two versions. These are the Turtles who first carried Sai and Katana in black and white pages drawn by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, the versions who killed the Shredder in their first major story arc, and whose world had no compunction about showing the consequences of violence. Their arrival reframes the entire crossover. This isn't a team-up of superficially different characters who happen to share a name. It's a confrontation with the source material itself, and the original Mirage Turtles carry an implicit authority that neither animated version can match. Their Leonardo doesn't negotiate. Their Raphael doesn't quip. Their presence forces both animated teams to reckon with what they've softened and what they've preserved. The central antagonist, the ultimate Shredder, is a persistent threat who draws on technology from multiple sources across the multiverse. The combination strips away the weaknesses of both components. He's not a bumbling schemer, and he's not merely an alien warlord. He's a persistent, adaptive threat with access to the full technological arsenal of two franchises, pursuing a genocidal mission across the multiverse with chilling efficiency. The final act, which throws every available version of supporting characters simultaneously. Multiple incarnations of Splinter, April O'Neil from multiple realities, Casey Jones, and multiple versions of the Foot Clan, earns the spectacle because the threat justifies it. This isn't escalation for its own sake. Every additional dimension pulled into the fight represents a world that Chirel has already destroyed or is about to. What makes this landing matter beyond the story itself is what it proves about the crossover format. People tend to reach outside a property, into other franchises, into other media, when they want to generate excitement, and there's a widespread assumption that a crossover needs external IP to feel consequential. Turtles Forever dismantles that assumption entirely. Every character, every world, every version of every character in this film originates from the same 30-page black and white comic that Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird drew in 1984. The multiverse isn't a gimmick to bring in new audiences, it's a narrative architecture built from the franchise's own internal variations. The 1987 series, the 2003 series, and the original Mirage comics had diverged so dramatically in tone, style, and storytelling ambition that they were practically different properties. Turtles Forever recognized that divergence, treated it as the story's central engine, and proved that the richest crossover doesn't necessarily need a partner from outside the family. Sometimes the biggest event in a property's history is the one where it finally confronts every version of itself at once. TMNT in Injustice 2, NetherRealm Studios 2017. Turtles Forever at least earned its crossover with a genuine multiversal plot. Injustice 2 doesn't bother with that courtesy. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles landed in the Injustice universe in February 2018 as part of Fighter Pack 3, a $10 DLC drop for a game that had already shipped the previous May with its core roster locked. They materialized into a world where Superman had declared himself a tyrant and Batman was running a resistance, and apparently nobody at NetherRealm paused to consider whether 4 6-foot mutant turtles fit into a conflict about absolute power and the people opposing it. No intro cutscene, no dialogue, no handshake. They simply appear, 4 fighters on a select screen, occupying the space of a single character slot, ready to brawl alongside Darkseid and Brainiac. The compression is the first thing that demands attention. NetherRealm built the Turtles as one character on the roster, one portrait, one slot, one price tag. But they're all four brothers simultaneously. Pick that slot and you can cycle through Leonardo's katanas, Donatello's bow staff, Michelangelo's nunchaku, or Raphael's sais mid-fight. All four share the same foundational toolkit: Shellocopter, a dash attack fast enough to double as an invincible wake-up; Krang Tang, an aerial dive kick borrowed from Krang himself; Turtling, a defensive stance that absorbs projectiles clean with zero chip damage; and Bombshell, an overhead strike that can be enhanced to extend combos or bounce opponents off the canvas for a follow-up. Leonardo layers shredded and Boshi slice on top of that base. Donatello brings spinning splinters and an anti-air grab. Michelangelo has hot nunchaku fury. Each brother moves distinctly: Leonardo the disciplined rusher, Donatello the range disruptor, Michelangelo the chaotic mix-up artist, Raphael the aggressive rushdown. Yet they all live inside the footprint of one character, the kind of compression that makes fighting game players argue on message boards for months. The detail that keeps surfacing in fan conversations, the one that researchers circle without quite resolving, is whether the Turtles' absence from the story mode means they're not a real crossover at all, and that question cuts to something messier than most people want to admit. Injustice 2's campaign follows a full narrative arc, from Batman rebuilding his alliance to the final confrontation with Brainiac, and the Turtles simply do not appear in any of it. No stage where they crash through a wall, no dialogue where Batman acknowledges four giant reptiles fighting alongside him, no moment where any character reacts to the absurdity of four mutant turtles existing in a universe where the defining threat is a cybernetic alien collector. They appear only in arcade mode versus matches, and the cosmetic gear and sticker systems that let players dress up other fighters with turtle-themed accessories. The entire crossover is mechanical. Four licensed skins with unique movesets bolted onto a game that has no narrative place for them. That's not a crossover in the storytelling sense. It's a licensing arrangement wearing the uniform of one. It's easy to point to the Easter eggs as evidence of genuine integration. The Big Apple 3 a.m. stickers on Michelangelo's skateboard, the wind pose that recreates the 1987 cartoon's opening credits, the defeat animation where the turtles sit down and flash in a direct homage to the original Konami arcade cabinet. Those are affectionate flourishes, not narrative integration. They're the kind of detail that says someone on the design team grew up on the same cartoon you did. They make the turtles feel like they belong in the fight. They don't make them belong in the story. The distinction matters. It's the difference between a crossover that earns its place and one that purchases it. The human strangeness of it is that NetherRealm put genuine craft into making them feel distinct in combat. Every brother animates differently. Every shared move has visual personality. The voice lines have actual bite. And all of that work went into content the story mode pretends doesn't exist. You can play through the entire campaign, beat every chapter, and the turtles are simply not there. They occupy the menu, the roster, and the $10 you paid. The game's fiction forgets they ever arrived. TMNT Ghostbusters, IDW Publishing, 2014. Where the Injustice 2 deal was a licensing transaction that borrowed the shape of a crossover, this one is a real crossover that happens to wear the name of a comic book series. The 4-part miniseries from IDW in 2014 didn't drop the Turtles into another universe as fighters with no narrative purpose. It wrote them a genuine multiverse event with consequences that rippled back into both the TMNT and Ghostbusters ongoing series. A portal malfunction, the kind that seems to happen to the Turtles every other Tuesday, pulls Leonardo and Donatello out of their New York and drops them into a version of the city under siege by every ghost the Ghostbusters haven't caught yet. This isn't the Ghostbusters from the cartoon or the movies, exactly. It's the IDW continuity version, which had been building its own mythology of supernatural horror since 2013, and the two worlds had never collided until Tom Waltz and Eric Burnham laid out a 4-issue plot that genuinely read like neither team could afford to lose. The dimensional portal that brought the Turtles into the Ghostbusters New York becomes the focus of both teams' efforts, with the Turtles needing to find their way home before the instability consumes both worlds. The Turtles didn't travel alone. A faulty dimensional device is never a clean one-way trip, and something from the other side followed them through. The resulting conflict spans all 4 issues without padding, with the writing team, led by Tristan Jones, keeping both rosters distinct and in character throughout. Leonardo is the strategic leader trying to solve the portal problem. Donatello is the one who can build around it. Michelangelo provides the comic relief that lightens the Ghostbusters' grim demeanor, with Slimer drawn to the Turtles' chaotic energy in several memorable panels. The artist Dan Schoening drew the Ghostbusters with the same fluid energy he brought to the TMNT series, which matters more than it sounds. Crossover art that feels like two franchises stapled together is the failure mode, and Schoening's line work makes both teams look like they belong in the same rain-slicked, neon-lit New York. The events of the miniseries fed into both continuities, with the dimensional instability becoming a recurring element in the TMNT series' supernatural storylines. That kind of narrative entanglement is what separates a crossover that earns its existence from one that exists because a licensing deal was signed. The four-issue structure forced a tight story with no room for padding or fan service detours, and the result is a comic that reads as a genuine event in both continuities, rather than a temporary gimmick. The design of it, two properties that have always lived in adjacent tonal neighborhoods, both born in the mid-'80s, both built on teams of four fighting supernatural threats in New York City with the help of a mad scientist, both carried forward by fan communities that refused to let them die, made the fit feel inevitable in retrospect. The Ghostbusters had spent a year in IDW's hands building a mythos that was darker and more serialized than anything the cartoon or films had attempted. The Turtles in 2014 were in the middle of their most acclaimed run, deep into a storyline about ancient mystical conflict and family betrayal. Putting them together didn't dilute either property, it sharpened both. Batman.TMNT, DC Comics, 2015 to 2019. The series is a contained team-up that never has to justify why two oddball franchises are sharing screen time. Both already operated in the same weird fiction register. This pairing has no such structural advantage. Krang yanks the Turtles, Splinter, and the Shredder out of their New York dimension and drops them in Gotham City, and suddenly the two most brooding action franchises in comics have to share a skyline, a tone, and a city that both claim as their own. The conflict writes itself before anyone draws a single panel. Batman is Gotham's apex predator, a man with no superpowers who takes down metahumans, vigilantes, and cosmic threats through sheer preparation and an unbreakable moral code. The Turtles are four genetically enhanced ninja warriors trained from childhood by a rat who once belonged to a ninja master. They've been fighting a giant brain with a walking war machine since they were 14, and they have exactly the same no-killing rule Batman does. Put them in the same city and the collision is instant. Batman sees four heavily armed mutants moving through Gotham and assumes the worst. The Turtles see a guy in a bat costume who throws batarangs and looks like he runs on pure anger, and they assume the worst. Nobody has the social skills to defuse the situation before it becomes a fight. And then the Shredder gets involved. Oroku Saki didn't spend decades building a criminal empire across dimensions just to take a backseat in Gotham, and the crossover is smart enough to treat him as a threat Batman genuinely has to think about. Krang is also there, and while he spends a lot of the story operating as the true final boss, the immediate tension comes from the fact that Batman is suddenly managing a three-front war: alien warlord, ancient ninja assassin, and four confused teenagers who keep treating Wayne Enterprises like a tech store they're looting for supplies. Batman interrogating Leonardo is one of those matchups that sounds like fanfiction until you read it. Two leaders who've both been trained from childhood, both shoulder the weight of family expectations, both have a code they refuse to break, and both are far more disciplined than the situation warrants. The dynamic works because both sides earn each other's respect, rather than having it handed to them. Here's the part that should have been the headline. This isn't some multiverse shenanigans where one version of a character meets another. This is the IDW Turtles, in their full contemporary continuity, landing in the DC universe proper, with all the tonal weight that implies. DC editorial signed off on a crossover that placed four mutant reptile ninja in the same continuity as Superman and the Justice League, and the story takes that placement seriously enough that Batman treats the situation as a genuine crisis rather than a one-off joke. The art reflects this. Freddie E. Williams II draws Gotham with the same rain-soaked oppressive density as any Batman story, and the Turtles carry their weight in those panels. They look like they belong in the dark, even when they're making pizza jokes, which they absolutely are. The tone never abandons who either property is. The Turtles are still quippy, still eating pizza in an alley somewhere, still bickering about who gets to drive the party wagon. Batman is still Batman, still intense, still 3 steps ahead, still treating a giant brain in a tank with the same measured concern he'd treat the Joker. The script earns the crossover by respecting both franchises simultaneously, which is harder than it sounds. And then it gets better. The crossover spawned an animated film adaptation in 2019 that most fans assumed would be a lightweight cash-in, and instead it's one of the best Ninja Turtles films ever made. Batman vs. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles took the comic's 6-issue story and compressed it into an animated feature that somehow found room to include every major player from both rosters. Shredder, Krang, Bane, the Penguin, Splinter gets action scenes, Casey Jones gets action scenes, and it all somehow hangs together. The animation is gorgeous, the fight choreography is legitimate, and the film understood something the comic only gestured at, that Batman and the Turtles work as a team because they're both fundamentally underdog properties fighting against impossible odds with nothing but discipline and each other. The film hit the same notes the comic established and amplified them, which is the rarest kind of adaptation, one that understands why the original worked, and builds outward from that understanding, rather than treating it as a checklist of cameos to include. That brings us to the central puzzle this crossover leaves behind. Batman/Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles did something no one predicted it could do. It made the Turtles feel at home in the DC universe. Not as a joke, not as a guest appearance, but as characters who could genuinely exist in that world without either property losing what makes it distinct. The comic ended, the film came and went, and DC never followed up, never greenlit an ongoing series, never revisited the crossover in a meaningful way. Why? It's possible the licensing difficulties between DC and IDW made a follow-up logistically complicated, but that's a real-world answer to what reads like a narrative failure. The story left open the door, and nobody walked through it. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tex Naruto. IDW Publishing joined forces with Viz Media to produce a 4-issue limited series set entirely in the Naruto universe. Not just the characters, but the entire power system of chakra, jutsu, and cursed seals, dumped directly into a story that already has mutant biology, interdimensional travel, and a centuries-old rat who knows karate. The series was written by Caleb Gullner, who'd previously written for IDW's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and had the kind of institutional knowledge of both continuities that made the crossover feel earned rather than opportunistic. The premise hinges on the one structural overlap both franchises have always quietly shared: ninjas. The Turtles were raised as ninjas. The Foot Clan is a ninja organization. The IDW comics had been deepening the Foot Clan's mystical elements for years, and Naruto's entire world is built on supernatural ninja combat, so the crossover exploits that gap directly. Orochimaru shows up in the TMNT universe and begins manipulating the Foot Clan from within, which immediately reframes the Turtles' entire ongoing war with the Foot as something far larger and far more cosmically dangerous than a street-level turf dispute. The Turtles spend the entire run reacting to a threat they didn't invite, operating in a power system they don't understand, against enemies who can do things like summon giant snakes and channel elemental energy through hand signs, abilities that make the Foot Clan's previous arsenal of swords and blasters look quaint by comparison. The 4-issue format does real work here. Gullner doesn't waste a single issue on origin stories or catch-up panels. Every page is calibrated for readers who already know both properties deeply, and the script reads like a love letter to long-term fans rather than an onboarding document. Naruto characters show up with their full power sets intact. The Turtles fight using everything they've developed across years of IDW continuity, and the resolution doesn't force either side to diminish themselves to make the other look better. That's harder than it sounds. Crossover comics frequently solve the who would actually win problem by having one side hold back, and this one doesn't bother with that cheap trick. The fight scenes treat every combatant as a genuine threat, which means the Turtles earn their victories against characters who could individually flatten most of their rogues gallery. The design of this series is straightforward and intentional. It was built for the overlap audience, readers who follow both IDW's TMNT run and the Naruto franchise, and it was built to deliver exactly what that audience wants, nothing more and nothing less. It doesn't try to bridge the tonal gap between a grounded mutant ninja story and a wuxia-tinged ninja epic with thousands of name techniques. It doesn't try to make either property accessible to someone walking in cold. It assumes you're already invested and spends all 4 issues rewarding that investment, which is a design choice that feels increasingly rare in modern crossover comics, where every team-up has to serve as an advertisement for 6 other titles. This one stays in its lane, executes cleanly, and ends exactly where it should, which is the most honest thing a limited series can do. TMNT Ghostbusters 2. The TMNT crossover with Naruto happened because someone looked at 2 ninja universes and recognized the obvious tonal logic: martial arts, honor codes, ancient lineages, secret societies running everything behind the scenes. It made sense on the surface, and it made sense in the execution. TMNT Ghostbusters 2 has no such excuse, and it doesn't need one. Written by Eric Burnham and Tom Waltz for IDW Publishing, the comic throws the Turtles back into a Ghostbusters crossover set in the IDW continuity where Splinter already ran the Foot Clan, died, and had his rival Darius Dunn executed for failing to acknowledge his authority. Now Dunn is back, sort of, because he struck a deal with the Collectors, interdimensional harvesters who eat realities for sport, and he's spending that deal on revenge against the Turtles for killing him. The question that should follow is, why of all the teams in fiction would anyone call the Ghostbusters to deal with this? The answer is that the IDW universe already had its own dimensional horror problem long before the Ghostbusters showed up. The Collectors exist outside any single reality's rules. They don't care about Splinter's authority, the Foot Clan's hierarchy, or the Turtles' code. They care about the deal, and Darius Dunn is the currency. The Ghostbusters bring containment systems designed for exactly this kind of threat. Dimensional expertise built over decades of ghostbusting, and the institutional memory of a team that once saved the world from a marshmallow man and an environmental lawyer in a tweed suit. The original 2014 TMN Ghostbusters crossover worked because both properties are fundamentally New York stories, paranormal teams using science and technology to deal with things that shouldn't exist in the 5 boroughs. The sequel operates on the same structural logic, but the tonal temperature has dropped considerably. The first Ghostbusters TMNT comic was an adventure story with tonal parallels. The second is a horror story with structural ones. Nobody in the story actually explains why the Ghostbusters are the right team for this. The setup presents their involvement as automatic. The dimensional breach requires containment. The Collectors require a team that understands cross-reality threats, and the Ghostbusters are standing right there. But the justification for why they're uniquely qualified is never made explicit. There's no moment where a character articulates why calling the Turtles alone isn't enough, or why the Ghostbusters' specific equipment makes them the only viable option. The narrative just assumes the reader accepts the crossover premise and moves forward, which raises a structural problem. If the Ghostbusters are interchangeable with any team that has dimensional expertise, then the crossover is happening because of brand recognition, not because the story requires it specifically. The truth is that the Ghostbusters are in this comic because the TMNT franchise had already established that dimensional threats were its wheelhouse, and the Ghostbusters were the most recognizable brand that also dealt with dimensional threats. It's not a tonal failure, it's a narrative shortcut dressed up as a team-up. The comic's actual preoccupation is with the IDW continuity itself, Splinter's legacy, the Foot Clan's restructuring, and the consequences of a leader who executes his rivals and then has to live with what that creates. The Ghostbusters provide the mechanic, containment, proton streams, dimensional traps, but they don't provide the dramatic engine. That belongs entirely to the IDW TMNT universe and what it demands from its own characters. The crossover justifies itself through the continuity's structural needs, not through any inherent logic of the team-up. This crossover's failures say something about what happens when the narrative engine and the crossover mechanic don't align. The story is genuinely interested in its own continuity. Darius Dunn's deal with the Collectors is a meaningful exploration of what happens to enemies a leader doesn't fully eliminate, but the Ghostbusters element remains a vehicle, not a participant. The comic earns points for treating the dimensional threat seriously and for weaving the crossover into existing continuity rather than treating it as a standalone event, but it loses them by never making the case that the Ghostbusters bring something the Turtles couldn't provide on their own. What this proves about the crossover category is that a team-up only earns its place when both halves of the equation have something the other requires. The Ghostbusters had the equipment, the Turtles had the continuity. Neither half needed the other the way the story pretended they did. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles x Hello Kitty and Friends. The Naruto crossover worked by matching two properties that already understood each other. Ninja fiction to ninja fiction, martial arts drama to martial arts drama, and a tonal register that both sides could meet in the middle. That approach assumes crossovers require some bridge of compatibility, some shared wavelength that justifies smashing two universes together. This one doesn't just break that assumption, it reveals the assumption was never load-bearing. This is a McDonald's Happy Meal promotion. The campaign included up to 12 brand new toys, and each Happy Meal came with one figurine and a character card revealing the character's unique skills and story. The four main turtles, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, Donatello, shared space with 5 Sanrio characters: Hello Kitty, Kuromi, Cinnamoroll, My Melody, and Batsmaru. Golden Wolf created the campaign's 2D cell animated ad and mixed media hero shots. Golden Wolf's animated ad showed Hello Kitty and friends and the turtles transforming into hybrid forms. Leonardo merging with Hello Kitty, Michelangelo with Cinnamoroll, Raphael with Batsmaru, Donatello with Kuromi, each transformation bursting with what the ad called turtle power, rendered in 2D cell animation that deliberately echoed the visual language of 1990s Saturday morning cartoons. The art direction wasn't trying to establish tonal compatibility between two fictional universes. It was trying to sell toys and Happy Meals by tapping into the exact nostalgia pipeline that had built the team's original audience in the first place. The 12 figurines paired the turtles with Sanrio characters in specific configurations: Cinnamoroll with Michelangelo, Hello Kitty with Leonardo, and each pairing came with a character card. The character cards explained the character's unique skills and story, which meant someone, somewhere, wrote backstory for a McDonald's Happy Meal toy crossover that exists primarily as a licensing exercise. The character cards are the detail that does the most damage to the idea that crossovers require narrative justification. Every other crossover in this video, even the Ghostbusters 2 sequel, even the Naruto crossover, at least attempted to build a story that explained why the two properties were in the same room together. The TMNT x Hello Kitty and Friends campaign didn't need a story because it wasn't selling a story. It was selling 12 toys, one per Happy Meal, with a 2D animation to make the pairing feel official. And yet the toy line demanded more creative decision-making about character interaction than the Ghostbusters 2 comic did. 12 figurines, 12 distinct pairings, 5 Sanrio characters, distributed across 4 turtles. Someone mapped that matrix and made choices about which character went with which turtle, and those choices reflect genuine design thinking. Kuromi with Donatello isn't random. It's a pairing of 2 characters defined by being underestimated. One because she's the goth kid of the Sanrio roster, and one because he's the nerd of the turtle team. Cinnamoroll with Michelangelo makes itself pure joy meeting pure joy. The toy line contains more intentional character design than the narrative that was supposed to justify it. The TMNT Tames Hello Kitty crossover proves that the crossover mechanism doesn't actually require the two properties to share tone, genre, or even story logic. It requires a licensing deal, a distribution channel, and someone willing to animate the result. The commercial crossover sometimes does more with the concept than the serious one because it isn't pretending the crossover is about anything other than itself. TMNT x Magic: The Gathering. The set carries the full official title, Magic: The Gathering Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and falls under Wizards of the Coast's Universes Beyond program, meaning it exists inside Magic's multiverse but outside its core continuity. Players can use these cards in sanctioned formats while the story world treats them as a distinct, self-contained universe. It's the second Magic set scheduled for release in 2026, with a worldwide date of March 6th. The product line includes the main set, source material bonus sheet cards, and pre-built commander decks. The set brings new legal cards to multiple Magic formats. Universes Beyond sets are frequently restricted to casual formats, but this one walks onto every competitive battlefield without apology. A pre-built commander deck anchors the product for multiplayer play, at the kitchen table and the tournament hall alike. The visual presentation is built for collectors. 4 all-new turtle cards illustrated by Kevin Eastman in the original style of the TMNT comics feature gold foil signatures. Co-creator of the Turtles, the man who drew the first issue back in 1984, and each one comes with a shiny signature foil stamp that appears exclusively in collector boosters, making them chase variants for the completist crowd. The set contains 20 source material cards that pull original artwork directly from TMNT's comics, its animated series, and its movies, bridging the Turtles' own visual history into Magic's card frame for the first time. The artistic scope alone spans 4 decades of a franchise. The mechanics are where things get genuinely interesting. The set introduces mutagen, is represented by A+1/1 counter in the set's mechanics, a clean mechanical echo of the ooze that created the Turtles themselves, translated into Magic's resource economy. Sneak is a new keyword that gives spells an optional alternative cost available during the declare blocker's step of combat, but casting it requires returning an unblocked attacker to its owner's hand, a tense risk-reward loop that mirrors the Turtles' habit of striking from unexpected angles at the worst possible moment for their enemies. The set also features returning mechanics from Magic's history: the Ghost in the Machine, the Vanishing Act, You walk into your local game store on March 6th and find a product line that covers every kind of Magic player. The casual fan who grew up watching the 2003 or 2012 series can pick up a draft booster for the art and the nostalgia. The Commander player finds new legal cards to slot into existing decks. Players of all skill levels can team up with the Turtles in this exciting new cooperative strategy format. That distribution strategy is doing something most crossovers only gesture at. It's genuinely meeting the audience where they already are. What this reveals about Magic as a system is that Universes Beyond has evolved from a novelty curiosity into a structural pillar of the game's growth model. Early sets like the first Modern Horizons and the Warhammer crossover proved that external IP could draw new players in, but this release is the signal that Wizards of the Coast now treats crossovers as first-class product lines, with full-format legality, premium collector variants, and mechanical innovation, not just licensed fan service. The Turtles landing inside competitive formats with custom keywords isn't a marketing stunt. It's evidence that Magic's multiverse has expanded far beyond the Planeswalkers, and that the company believes the game's next wave of growth lives outside its original fiction. TMNT, Savage Dragon. The crossover was published by Mirage Studios in partnership with Image Comics, keeping it firmly inside the original Mirage Studios TMNT continuity, the one where the Turtles are mutants first, heroes by accident, and still reckoning with the violence that created them. It was written and drawn by Michael Dooney, a name that carries serious weight in TMET history, having been part of the original Mirage Studios creative circle from the earliest issues. On the other side of the partnership sits Savage Dragon, the flagship character of Image Comics, a massive, amnesiac, green-skinned humanoid dragon with superhuman strength and accelerated healing, a cop in a city overrun with superhuman threats. Created by Erik Larsen as the standard-bearer for the independent comics explosion of the early 1990s. The story opens with Raphael alone, traveling by train to Chicago. He isn't fighting Shredder or the Foot Clan in this one. He's chasing a threat called Complete Carnage, a villain violent enough to pull one turtle out of the sewers and onto public transit, which tells you everything about how dangerous this particular problem is. Raphael arrives in Chicago and immediately runs into the Underground Freaks, a crew of superhuman street-level threats that already populate Savage Dragon's world, and the fight is on. The dragon himself intervenes before Raphael is overwhelmed, and the two heroes, one a mutant turtle raised in darkness, the other a nearly indestructible dragon cop with no memory of his own origin, circle each other with the instinctive understanding of two warriors who know they're on the same side before they've exchanged a full sentence. The conflict escalates as Leonardo, Donatello, and Michelangelo join Raphael in Chicago, bringing the full team together for the final confrontation. From there, the battle becomes a full four-turtle brawl against Complete Carnage with the Savage Dragon in the mix, and the resolution is pure Larsen physics. The dragon grabs Carnage and launches him into Lake Michigan, which for a character who can survive virtually anything, is more of a parking ticket than an ending, but plays perfectly as a story beat. The story continues in Savage Dragon #22, confirming this as the second of 3 TMAT Savage Dragon crossover arcs spanning from Savage Dragon #2 through the mid-1990s. Does the Turtles for Hire model work as a crossover engine? In this case, it works specifically because Raphael traveling alone to another city is one of the most TMET things that ever happened. They've always functioned better as a unit, and forcing Raphael into a solo mission against an unfamiliar landscape strips away their usual advantages and puts the character's stubbornness and improvisation front and center. The choice to hand the art to Dooney means the Turtles look and move exactly as Mirage Studios fans remember them, while the dragon is drawn by Larsen in his own house style. The two visual languages don't blend so much as share a page with mutual respect, which is exactly how independent comics creators treated crossovers in that era. It's a handshake between two worlds that were born from the same impulse and were never really meant to stay separate. TMNT Meet the Lone Gunman. Whatever was quietly ambitious about the previous crossover becomes overtly strange here. At least Savage Dragon stayed within the language of comics. This one drags the Turtles into a world built around alien conspiracies and FBI paranoia, and the tonal collision is deliberate. The X-Files conspiracy Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles hit comic shops in 2014 as part of IDW's larger The X-Files Conspiracy event, a publishing gambit that expanded Chris Carter's paranormal investigation universe into a crossover with the Turtles, bringing the lone gunman face-to-face with mutant reptiles hiding in Northampton. The Turtles' entry was not a casual team-up but a full immersion into Mulder and Scully's world, and the story makes the most counterintuitive casting choice imaginable. The Turtles are not the protagonists. They're suspects. The real leads are the lone gunmen, John Fitzgerald Byers, Richard Langley, and Melvin Frohike, the conspiracy-obsessed trio from The X-Files, who spend their lives tracking cover-ups the rest of the world dismisses as paranoid fantasy, and their latest investigation has led them to something that sounds exactly like an urban legend come to life. 4 giant talking reptiles, ninja-trained, living in the shadows of New York City? To Byers, that's not absurd. That's a lead. The gunmen are chasing a far deadlier puzzle than mutant turtles, though. A plague is coming, and the people who are about to die have already done something remarkably specific. They ordered food from a place called Golden Pizza, and every last one of them had their shoes removed before they were found. The pattern points to something organized and intelligent, not random, and the gunman's trail stretches from Washington out to Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where the Turtles happen to be lying low. After years of street battles across New York, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo have retreated to the rural safety of their family's old farmhouse, hiding from the Foot Clan's persistent reach, and they've brought April O'Neil and Casey Jones with them. So when 3 men in trench coats start poking around town asking about giant reptiles, the Turtles are understandably not thrilled about introducing themselves. The gunmen, for their part, are fully committed to the idea that the Turtles are either the source of the plague or the key to stopping it, possibly both, and their demands for blood samples land somewhere between genuine scientific desperation and the kind of invasive paranoia that has defined their entire existence. The Turtles refuse, which is not stubbornness so much as basic self-preservation. The last thing a group of mutated Ninja Turtles hiding from the Foot needs is to hand over biological evidence to 3 men who work for a government that officially doesn't exist. The real threat, it turns out, is hiding in plain sight at Golden Pizza. The victims all share one connection. Each one had ordered food from the same place before falling victim to whatever is coming. A vampire nest has infiltrated the area, turning a local restaurant into both a feeding ground and a distribution point for the pathogen fueling the coming plague. The gunman's conspiracy instincts were correct about the cover-up and wrong about who was behind it. The threat isn't extraterrestrial or government-engineered, but something far older and far more physical, which is exactly the kind of answer the lone gunmen have spent their entire careers refusing to accept. The Turtles, once they understand what's actually happening, have no choice but to move from suspects to participants, and the final confrontation at Golden Pizza forces the gunmen to work alongside giant mutant ninjas against a nest of predatory vampires who have been using a pizza delivery service as their hunting ground. Nothing about this crossover plays out like anyone expected. Not the gunmen, not the Turtles, and certainly not anyone who picked up the book expecting a straightforward action story. And the messy, unclassifiable energy of it is precisely what makes it work. The X-Files was always at its best when it abandoned the alien mythology and remembered that monsters are scarier when they're real, and this story channels that exact instinct, dropping the Turtles into a world where the conspiracy theorists were right about everything except the aliens. The real answer is simpler and more corporate than any in-universe explanation could satisfy. IDW held the publishing rights to both the X-Files and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles at the same time, and the math of a crossover was too convenient to ignore, which is why 4 giant reptiles fighting vampires in Massachusetts exists at all. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles G.I. Joe. A Real Reptilian Hero was the promotional title for a figure line that physically mashed up 2 of the most iconic 80s action figure properties, and unlike every other entry on this list, it never produced a comic story, a cartoon episode, or any narrative content whatsoever. There was no plot to explain, no tonal bridge to build between a franchise about radioactive turtle martial artists and one about elite soldiers fighting a terrorist organization called Cobra, because the crossover existed entirely as plastic and cardboard. The crossover combines 2 of the most iconic properties in 1980s action figure history. Leonardo was paired with Snake Eyes in the figure lineup, the 2 stoic, masked, sword-wielding team leaders who communicate more through action than words, a mirror image pairing that made immediate visual sense. Donatello hooked up with Dial Tone, G.I. Joe's communications specialist, fusing the Turtles' tech genius with military-grade signal equipment. Shredder received Cobra Commander as his villain counterpart, 2 megalomaniacal warlords who both wear their identities like armor, one a supernatural ninja master in an alien-inspired suit, the other a disfigured military genius wrapped in blue, and their pairing is the crossover's clearest statement of intent. Slash, the violent rogue mutant turtle, matched with Storm Shadow, Cobra's own conflicted ninja mercenary, while Bebop and Rocksteady, the Turtles' comic relief bruisers, paired with Ripper and Buzzer from the Dreadnoks, the anarchic Cobra subsidiary crew defined by chaos and heavy weaponry. 2 vehicle sets were planned alongside the figures. The Turtlefly copter carried spinning katana helicopter blades, firing missiles, and a rappel line, a vehicle that could not have been designed with any narrative purpose in mind, and was clearly built to make a kid on a toy aisle stop walking. The Turtlefly copter features spinning katana helicopter blades, firing missiles, and a rappel line. The AWE Shell Striker is an all-terrain scout vehicle with functioning missile launchers and space for a full Ninja Turtle Joe team. The packaging leaned into retro styling that made the whole line look like it had been pulled from a forgotten warehouse somewhere. The fonts, the color palettes, the layout all deliberately echoed the visual language of both the classic 1988 T-Temp toy line and the original Hasbro G.I. Joe, a real American hero packaging from the same era, as if these figures had always existed together and were only now being rediscovered. The packaging was retro-themed, inspired by the aesthetics of both classic TMNT and G.I. Joe toy lines. Each figure came packed with accessories drawn from both sides of the pairing, katanas alongside combat knives, bow staffs alongside military walkie-talkies, nunchucks next to bandoliers, so that the crossover felt physical in a way a comic panel never could. This was not a lazy rebox of existing figures. It was a new sculpt program built from scratch, with custom head sculpts, unique costume pieces, and vehicle designs that required genuine engineering work, which means someone invested real creative labor into a product that had no story to justify it. Every pairing makes sense if you understand the assignment. This was designed for the person who grew up owning both toy lines and who, as an adult, still felt the specific pull of that shelf space where the Ninja Turtles aisle met the G.I. Joe aisle. It was never a crossover in the narrative sense, and that's exactly what made it the purest form of the idea. The kind where 2 worlds meet not because the writers needed a plot, but because the collectors needed the plastic. And the human strangeness of wanting to hold a world where Leonardo and Snake Eyes could stand on the same shelf was reason enough to build it.